The snowstorm outside raged with a merciless force, howling through the narrow streets of Portland, Maine. The Bennett's house stood close to the waterfront, its old wooden frame creaking under the weight of the wind. Charles Bennett, a sculptor whose hands carried decades of chiseling stone, sat near the fire, sharpening his tools. Patricia, his wife, stirred a pot of soup in the kitchen. Their home smelled faintly of cedarwood, warmth battling against the icy storm pressing at the windows. Upstairs, their daughter Lauren sat quietly at her desk, penning notes for her final semester. She had always been the pride of her parents. Intelligent, disciplined, graceful in a way that made neighbors say she was bound for something remarkable. Her long dark hair framed a face more serious than her 23 years. That evening, however, a tension weighed in her chest heavier than the snow outside. She knew she had to speak. She descended the stairs, her footsteps soft against the old floorboards. "Mom, Dad, I need to tell you something," she said, her voice steady, though her hands trembled slightly. Charles set down his chisel. Patricia wiped her hands on a towel and turned expectant. "I'm getting married." For a moment, silence swallowed the room, broken only by the rattling of the windows and the storm. Charles frowned, uncertain if he had heard correctly. Patricia blinked rapidly, searching her daughter's face for some sign of a joke. "To whom?" Charles asked slowly. "His name is Daniel," Lauren replied, her eyes shining with a kind of determined glow. "He's from Nigeria. We studied together at the university. He asked me to marry him and I said yes." Patricia gasped, her hand gripping the edge of the counter. "Nigeria. Lauren, are you serious?" "Very serious," Lauren said, her voice firmer now, the color drained from Charles's face. "Do you realize what you're saying? That country is half a world away. You would be living under laws, under traditions we don't even understand. Have you thought about the dangers? About what kind of life you'd have there?" Lauren nodded quickly, as if she had prepared herself for every protest. "I know what you're worried about, but Daniel is not like that. He's educated, respectful, loving. He's not some stranger. I've spent years with him in class, in projects. He's different from the stereotypes you've heard." Patricia shook her head, tears already forming in her eyes. "Lauren, there are things we cannot ignore. In some places, polygamy is common. Women don't have the same rights. There are diseases, malaria, infections. What happens if you get sick? And what about children? Do you expect to raise them without the freedoms you've known here?" Lauren's voice cracked slightly, but did not falter. "I've heard all of it before, but I've also spoken to people who are happy, who've built real families. I can't let fear control my choices. I love him. That's enough." Charles rose from his chair, towering in the dim light of the living room. "Enough. Love alone doesn't keep you safe. Love doesn't guarantee respect or rights or health. You think you're prepared, but you're not. You'll be isolated, far from us, surrounded by people who may not even see you as one of their own." Lauren's hands clenched into fists at her sides. "Dad, I've made my decision. I don't need permission. I'm telling you because you're my parents, because I love you. But I am going to marry Daniel." The words landed like stones. Patricia pressed a hand against her chest, struggling to breathe evenly. Charles's jaw tightened, his heart torn between anger and fear. Finally, Patricia's voice broke through, quiet and trembling. "When after graduation, he wants to hold a ceremony here so you can be part of it. Then we'll go to Nigeria for a second ceremony with his family." Charles looked at his daughter. The same girl he had carried on his shoulders through Portland's old wharves. The girl he had taught to carve little wooden animals in his workshop. Now she stood before him, a woman determined to chart her own course, even if it meant tearing his heart apart. He exchanged a glance with Patricia. Her eyes red with tears mirrored his own helplessness. They knew there was no changing Lauren's mind. The storm outside howled louder, rattling the glass panes as though echoing the chaos within their home. Finally, Charles lowered himself back into his chair, his voice heavy. "If this is what you've decided, then we'll stand by you. But don't mistake acceptance for peace in our hearts." Patricia wrapped her arms around her daughter, clinging as if afraid she would vanish that very night. Lauren held her tightly, whispering, "It'll be okay, Mom. You'll see." But as the fire crackled and the storm pressed harder against the old wooden house, both parents knew that nothing about this path would be simple. The wedding was no longer a distant possibility. It was coming, and with it, a future they could not control. The wedding day arrived with a thin layer of snow, still clinging to the sidewalks of Portland. Inside the banquet hall, chandeliers glowed warmly, fighting back the chill seeping through the old walls. Lauren looked radiant in a white gown that Patricia had helped her choose, lace draping gracefully over her shoulders. Her veil shimmered softly in the light, and for a moment, anyone watching could believe this was a perfect day. Friends from the university filled the room, laughing and taking photographs. Distant relatives arrived with cautious smiles, shaking hands with Daniel, the tall, soft-spoken groom who wore a tailored suit. His accent marked him as foreign, but his posture was confident. Charles and Patricia stood close together, welcoming guests, wearing smiles that never reached their eyes. They greeted Daniel politely, but in their hearts, anise noted like termites in old wood. When the vows were exchanged, Patricia clutched a tissue, whispering prayers under her breath. Charles kept his face stern, though his chest tightened with every word his daughter spoke. He saw the joy on her face, the way she held Daniel's hand as though nothing else in the world mattered. That joy, pure and defiant, silenced his protests. By the end of the evening, when applause rang out and champagne glasses clinked, the Bennets played their part, smiling, hugging, congratulating. Yet behind every embrace lingered fear of what lay ahead. The following months passed quickly. Lauren completed her degree, Daniel at her side, promising her a future together. Then came the day of departure at Portland International Jetport. Patricia wrapped her arms around her daughter, refusing to let go. Charles placed a firm hand on Lauren's shoulder, his voice low. "Remember, if you need us, call. We'll always answer." Lauren smiled, though her eyes glistened with tears. "I'll be fine. I'll come back to visit. You'll see." The flight carried them across the Atlantic, across continents, into a world Lauren had only known through Daniel's stories. Legos greeted her with a wall of heat that pressed against her skin like a heavy blanket. The air buzzed with noise, car horns blaring, street vendors shouting, music spilling from open shops. The chaotic rhythm of the city wrapped around her, overwhelming yet strangely alive. Their new home was not a quiet apartment like she had imagined, but a house filled with relatives. Daniel's parents, siblings, and cousins moved in and out freely, their voices echoing through narrow hallways. Meals were loud and crowded. The food spiced with flavors Lauren had never tasted. She tried to smile, tried to adapt. The warmth of Daniel's family was genuine. Yet, she felt like an outsider stepping into a dance she did not know. Still, in those early weeks, Lauren clung to hope. Daniel was attentive, proud to show her his country. He took her to markets where stalls overflowed with bright fabrics, to beaches where the Atlantic stretched wide and restless, so different from the gray Maine coastline. At night, they would call her parents through video chat. Lauren's voice carried laughter then, telling her mother how she was learning to cook local dishes, how she was getting used to the noise, how she was happy. Patricia's heart ached with both relief and longing each time the call ended, but gradually subtle shifts appeared. Daniel grew more rigid. He deferred constantly to his parents, seeking their approval on every decision. With Lauren, he became demanding, insisting she follow his rules, how she should dress when she could leave the house, what she should say to neighbors. The man who had once bent down to pick up her books at university now stood taller with authority, expecting obedience. Lauren tried to dismiss it as adjustment, as cultural difference. She told herself she could compromise, that love required sacrifice. Yet late at night, when the power cut out, and the house fell into suffocating darkness, she lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan that no longer moved, and felt the weight of a new kind of storm pressing down, one that no snow or wind could match. Her calls home grew shorter, her laughter thinner. Charles noticed the tremor in her voice, the way her eyes darted when she shifted the camera. Patricia sensed it too, but neither dared push too hard. To question was to risk losing what little access they had to her world. And so, like actors on a fragile stage, they smiled through each call, while silent fear grew stronger with every passing week. For Lauren, the contrast between Maine and Lagos could not have been starker. She remembered the quiet snow-dusted streets of Portland, the smell of cedar in her father's workshop, the calm rhythm of waves against the cold shore. Here the heat suffocated, the chaos never ceased, and the woman she had been seemed to drift further away each day. The honeymoon phase was over. What remained was a reality she could no longer ignore. The call came on an ordinary evening. Patricia had just finished folding laundry when her phone buzzed with a video call from Legos. Lauren's face filled the screen, pale but glowing in a way Patricia had not seen for months. "Mom, Dad," she began, her voice shaking, "I'm pregnant." Patricia dropped the basket of clothes. Charles, hearing from across the room, leaned forward, eyes wide. For a moment, silence wrapped around them. Then Patricia covered her mouth with both hands. Tears slipped through her fingers. Charles managed a broken laugh. Are you serious?" Lauren nodded, her eyes glistening. "Yes, I'm going to have a baby. And I want to come home. I don't feel safe here. The hospitals, they're not what I trust. I want to give birth in Maine." Charles felt his chest loosen for the first time in months. Patricia pressed her hand to the screen as though she could reach through it. "Come home, darling. We'll prepare everything. You won't be alone." Within weeks, flights were booked. The Bennett moved quickly, preparing the small upstairs bedroom with fresh linens, a cradle by the window, and shelves lined with neatly folded baby clothes. Patricia pulled out tiny blankets she had saved from Lauren's own infancy, washing them carefully. Tears wetting the fabric. Charles set to work repairing the old rocking chair, sanding down the arms so it would be smooth and safe. The night of Lauren's arrival, snow drifted lazily over Portland's airport. Patricia clutched Charles's arm so tightly he could feel her nails through his coat. Then across the terminal they saw her, Lauren stepping through the gate in a long coat, her hands protectively over her swelling stomach. Patricia ran first, pulling her daughter into her arms, sobbing openly. "You're home. You're really home," she whispered again and again. Charles embraced them both, his hand resting on his daughter's back. He searched her face, noticing the exhaustion there, the thinness of her frame, but also something new. Hope. In the weeks that followed, the house filled with anticipation. Patricia accompanied Lauren to prenatal checkups at Maine Medical Center, listening carefully as doctors discussed risks and procedures. Lauren's pregnancy was considered high risk. Her small frame and the stress of the past year worried the physicians. Still, every heartbeat on the monitor, every grainy ultrasound image gave the family renewed strength. Charles adjusted his workshop schedule, carving only in the mornings so he could drive his daughter to appointments in the afternoons. Patricia cooked nourishing meals, fussing over every detail. In those moments, they allowed themselves to believe life might turn toward peace. Then came the night of labor. Snow fell thick outside the hospital as Lauren cried out, gripping the rails of the bed. Hours stretched into what felt like days. Doctors and nurses moved quickly, voices clipped but calm. Patricia sat in the waiting room, rosary beads in her trembling hands, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years. Charles paced the length of the hallway, jaw clenched, unable to stand still. Finally, the door opened. A doctor's voice called softly, "Mr. and Mrs. Bennett." Charles turned instantly. "Is she?" "She's stable," the doctor said. The baby was large for her frame. The delivery difficult, but they're both alive. Patricia collapsed into tears, her legs nearly giving way. Charles caught her, holding her tightly as relief flooded them both. When they entered the room, Lauren lay exhausted, her hair damp against her forehead, her face pale but glowing. In her arms rested a tiny bundle wrapped in hospital blankets. "Meet your granddaughter," she whispered. Charles stepped closer, his breath catching. The baby had a shock of dark hair, skin soft and warm, and eyes that blinked up with startling alertness. Patricia reached out, brushing a finger over the child's cheek. "Maya," Lauren said softly. "Her name is Maya." The room seemed to fill with light. The storm outside forgotten. For the first time in months, joy outweighed fear. Charles kissed his daughter's forehead, whispering, "You're both safe. That's all that matters." The days that followed were a blur of visitors, photographs, and sleepless nights. Patricia hummed lullabies as she cradled Maya in the rocking chair, remembering when she had once done the same for Lauren. Charles carved a small wooden angel and placed it above the cradle. A silent guardian watching over the child. Neighbors came by with casseroles, friends with flowers, all congratulating the family. Lauren smiled more than she had in years. Her laughter returned, soft but real, filling the rooms with warmth. For a brief time, the Bennetts allowed themselves to believe that the storm had passed, that perhaps at last peace had returned to their home. The sound of Maya's cries in the night was not a burden, but a melody, a promise of new beginnings. And in those quiet hours, when Patricia held her granddaughter against her chest and felt the tiny heartbeat fluttering like a bird's wing, she whispered into the dark, "You'll be okay. We'll make sure of it." For them all, it seemed like the worst was behind them. Life, for once, felt almost whole again. Winter loosened its grip on Portland, and the first hints of spring crept across the city. For the Bennetts, those early days with Maya felt like a fragile blessing. Patricia busied herself with bottles, diapers, and lullaby bees, while Charles balanced his time between his workshop and helping his wife. Lauren, though exhausted, seemed proud to hold her daughter, to rock her gently in the evenings. For a brief moment, the rhythm of family life steadied, but cracks soon appeared. Some mornings, Lauren would burst into laughter over nothing at all, spinning Maya's rattle in her hands as if it were the most hilarious object she had ever seen. Hours later, without warning, she would collapse into tears, shoulders shaking, insisting that no one understood her, that everyone judged her. Patricia, who had seen the shadows of postpartum depression before in friends, told herself it was natural. Hormones, fatigue, the weight of new motherhood. She reassured Charles with soft words, though her own chest tightened with unease. One evening, as Charles returned from his workshop, he found Lauren in the kitchen. She stood by the sink, a small amber pill bottle clutched in her hand. Without hesitation, she tossed a tablet into her mouth and swallowed quickly. "What are you taking?" Charles asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Lauren jumped, turning toward him with wide eyes. "It's medicine. The doctor gave it to me." Charles extended his hand. "Then, show me the prescription." Her jaw tightened. "Why do you always have to control me?" I said, "It's from a doctor." If it was prescribed, you wouldn't be afraid to let me see it, Charles replied, his tone low, but unyielding. Years of sculpting stone had given him a steadiness that now pressed against his daughter's defiance. Lauren's cheeks flushed with sudden anger. She shoved past him, the pill bottle rattling as it slipped into her pocket. You don't trust me. You never have. Her footsteps thundered up the stairs, the bedroom door slamming shut. Charles stood frozen in the kitchen, the echo of her words clanging in his ears. When Patricia returned a few minutes later, she found him still gripping the edge of the counter. She's taking something, he said, his voice strained. Not from any doctor here. No prescription. You saw how she reacted. Patricia pressed her lips together, forcing calm into her tone. It could be antidepressants. Maybe something she brought back with her. We don't know. Don't jump to the worst conclusion. Charles shook his head, anger and fear battling in his chest. You saw how defensive she was. If it were safe, she'd have shown me. Patricia, I think it's drugs. Maybe from Legos. God knows what she got into there. Patricia's hands trembled as she set down the grocery bags she was holding. Don't say that. Don't make it real. She's just struggling. New mothers struggle. It doesn't mean. Her voice broke and tears filled her eyes. That night, the house felt heavier than the storm clouds pressing over the harbor. Lauren remained in her room, barely speaking at dinner, her eyes darting with restless energy. When Maya cried, Patricia stepped in quickly, afraid to hand the baby over. Charles pretended to read in his armchair, but his eyes never left the stairs. Days turned into weeks, and Lauren's mood swung wider. Some mornings she was radiant, carrying Maya through the living room with songs that filled the air. Other nights she sat in silence, her gaze fixed out the window, face empty, as if the ocean beyond called to her in ways no one else could hear. Patricia clung to hope, repeating the words, "Just hormones like a prayer." But the excuses rang hollow when Lauren lashed out at Charles again, this time screaming that he had no right to question her choices, no right to invade her privacy. Charles, though shaken, refused to shout back. He only stared at his daughter, wondering when the young woman, who once carved wooden trinkets in his workshop, had been replaced by this stranger. Fear began to seep into the corners of their days. Patricia no longer left Maya alone with Lauren, inventing reasons to keep the baby near. Charles checked trash bins for empty pill bottles, finding only fragments that deepened his suspicion. They avoided speaking of it directly, afraid the truth might shatter what little stability remained. At night, in the quiet after Maya's cries had faded, Charles and Patricia lay side by side, their whispers heavy with dread. "We're losing her," Charles murmured once, his voice cracking. Patricia reached for his hand, gripping it tightly as though she could tether him and herself to hope. But hope was slipping. With each passing day, Lauren drifted further, her laughter edged with hysteria, her silences longer and colder. The house that had once echoed with the promise of new life now held the sharp scent of fear. The Bennetts had weathered storms before, but this one was different. This was a storm rising inside their daughter, and no amount of firewood or prayer could keep it from tearing through their home. The day began like any other. Patricia bundled Maya into a stroller, wrapping her in a soft pink blanket against the early spring chill. The sidewalks of Portland still carried traces of snow, the air damp with salt drifting from the harbor. Lauren stood at the doorway, watching them leave. She smiled faintly, her eyes unreadable. "I'll see you when you get back," she said. Patricia leaned down to adjust the stroller. "We won't be long," she promised. Then she stepped out into the cold, unaware that this would be the last time she saw her daughter inside that house. 2 hours later, Patricia returned with flushed cheeks and a sleeping baby. She opened the front door, calling softly, "Lord, we're back." The house was silent. She pushed the stroller into the living room, expecting to hear footsteps from upstairs, but the rooms were empty. The closet by the door gaped open, several coats missing. Suitcases were gone. Panic rose in Patricia's throat. She hurried upstairs. Lauren's dresser drawers had been pulled out. Clothes gone. The jewelry box empty. Patricia's hands shook as she clutched her phone, dialing Charles with trembling fingers. "She's gone," Patricia whispered when he answered. "Her things, her suitcases, they're all gone. I can't find her." Charles's voice hardened instantly. "Stay with Maya. I'll check the airport." He drove recklessly, tires screeching around corners, heart pounding with every mile. The Portland International Jetport loomed ahead, its glass facade reflecting the gray afternoon light. Charles rushed inside, scanning the crowd, his eyes frantic. And then he saw her. Lauren stood near the check-in counter, suitcase at her feet, passport in hand. When she noticed her father striding toward her, her expression flickered between guilt and defiance. "Lauren," Charles said breathless, "what are you doing? Where are you going?" She looked away, shoulders tense. "Don't make this harder, Dad." "You left your daughter," he said, his voice trembling with both anger and desperation. "You walked out without a word. What does this mean? Explain it to me. Her eyes filled with something sharp, almost mocking. You really didn't see it, did you? Daniel and we've been using drugs for months. He lost his job. We were thrown out of his parents' house. We lived in a shack. There's nothing for us there. Nothing here either. Do you think I can raise a baby like that? Charles felt as if the ground had vanished beneath him. You're telling me you're abandoning her? Your own child. Lauren's lips quivered, but her tone stayed cold. If I take her back, she'll be taken from me the second they find out. At least here she has you and Mom. I'll tell Daniel's family the baby was stillborn. That way, no one will ask questions. Lauren, listen to yourself. Charles pleaded, stepping closer, his hands outstretched. We can help you. We'll get you into treatment. You can work. You can raise her here. You don't have to throw everything away. She shook her head violently, tears brimming. You don't understand. I love him. I can't leave him. If we go down together. Charles's chest ached with the weight of her words. He wanted to grab her to drag her back home, but all he could do was stand frozen as she lifted the suitcase onto the conveyor belt. Don't come after me, she said softly, almost tenderly, as if speaking to both him and the ghost of the daughter she once was. Take care of Maya. She deserves better than me. Then, with a final glance, a mixture of sorrow and resolve, Lauren turned toward the gate. The sliding doors swallowed her, her figure disappearing into the stream of departing passengers. Charles remained rooted in place, his fists clenched, his throat raw with words that would never reach her. Around him, the airport bustled with the rhythm of strangers' lives, indifferent to the collapse of his own. When he finally returned home, Patricia met him at the door, her face pale, her arms wrapped around Maya as if she could shield the child from the truth. Did you see her? Patricia asked, voice breaking. Charles nodded slowly, unable to meet his wife's eyes. She's gone. Back to Nigeria. She said not to look for her. Patricia's knees buckled and Charles caught her before she fell. Together they sank onto the couch, the baby between them, sleeping peacefully, unaware that her mother had chosen to vanish from her life. Outside the harbor winds rose, rattling the windows with a mournful cry. Inside, the Bennetts sat in silence, the weight of abandonment pressing against their chests. A family had been broken, and all that remained was the fragile hope they could salvage what was left for Maya's sake. At first, Patricia tried to convince herself it was only nerves, that every child developed differently. Maya was almost a year old when the doubts began to press harder. Other babies her age pulled themselves upright, babbled words that melted their parents' hearts. Maya, by contrast, struggled even to sit without toppling sideways. Her tiny hands dangled loosely at her sides, failing to grip the toys placed before her. One morning, Patricia sat on the living room rug, coaxing Maya with a brightly colored rattle. Come on, sweetheart. Just reach for it, she whispered. Maya's big, dark eyes followed the sound, but her fingers refused to curl. The rattle slipped from her grasp each time Patricia placed it in her palm. Patricia's throat tightened as she forced a smile. It's okay. We'll try again. When Charles came in from his workshop, dusting with shavings from his jacket, Patricia finally broke. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she clutched the rattle. Something's wrong, she whispered. She can't hold on to anything. She can't even sit up. Charles took the toy from her trembling hands, his own face pale. He looked at Maya lying awkwardly on the rug, her body stiff in some places and limp in others. For the first time, he let the fear he had buried rise to the surface. We need to see a specialist, he said quietly. Weeks later, they sat in a sterile office at Boston Children's Hospital, fluorescent lights humming above. Maya lay on an exam table while a pediatric neurologist ran careful tests, checking reflexes, guiding her tiny arms, studying her posture. Patricia's heart pounded with every note the doctor scribbled. Finally, the neurologist removed his glasses, his expression grave. Your granddaughter has cerebral palsy, he said gently. It was likely caused by complications during birth. The muscles in her arms and legs don't respond the way they should. With therapy, she can improve, but this will be a lifelong condition. The words struck like thunder. Patricia covered her mouth, choking back a sob. Charles's hands clenched on his knees, his knuckles white. The doctor continued, outlining physical therapy, occupational exercises, the possibility of speech delays. But the Bennetts heard only fragments, their minds reeling from the diagnosis. On the drive back to Portland, the silence in the car was unbearable. Patricia stared out the window, tears streaking her cheeks. Charles kept his eyes fixed on the road, his jaw locked tight. At home, Patricia cradled Maya against her chest, rocking her gently, whispering, "You're perfect. We'll help you. I promise." From that day forward, their lives revolved around Maya. Therapy sessions became the new routine. Trips into the city, long hours in waiting rooms, endless exercises designed to coax strength into fragile muscles. Patricia attended every appointment, carrying notebooks filled with instructions, repeating each exercise at home with tireless devotion. She turned the living room into a miniature therapy center. Mats covered the floor. Foam wedges propped Maya in place. Bright toys dangled from makeshift stands. "Lift your arm, baby girl." Patricia would coax, guiding her gently just a little higher. Each tiny success, a fist closing around a block, a wobbly attempt to roll over, felt like a triumph worth celebrating. But behind the celebrations were tears. Many nights when Maya was finally asleep, Patricia closed herself in the bathroom, muffling sobs into a towel. Charles often found her there, her shoulders shaking. He would wrap his arms around her, whispering, "We'll get through this. She's strong. We'll make her strong." Charles poured his pain into his workshop, chiseling stone late into the night. Yet even as he worked, his ears stayed tuned to the faint sounds from the house. Maya's cries, Patricia's soft lullabies, the rhythm of a family holding itself together through sheer will. As months turned into years, Maya grew. She learned to smile often, her dark eyes sparkling when Patricia sang or when Charles carved her little figurines to play with. Her body remained stiff, her movements awkward, but her mind was sharp, her laughter bright. Patricia clung to those moments, telling herself they were proof of hope. Still, the weight never left them. At every doctor's visit, Patricia waited for news that never came. That Maya might one day walk, that her condition might ease. Instead, the answers remained steady. Therapy could help, but the diagnosis would not change. For the Bennets, grief became a quiet companion. They mourned the future their granddaughter would never have. The dances, the carefree games, the independence. Yet at the same time, they fought fiercely for the future she could still claim. Education, love, dignity. Patricia's life narrowed to a single purpose. She no longer thought of her own health, her own dreams. Every ounce of her energy poured into Maya. Friends urged her to rest, to take time for herself, but she refused. "Maya needs me," she would say simply. And Charles, watching them together, knew she was right. His wife's devotion was the anchor holding their fragile world steady. But in the dark hours of the night, when Patricia finally fell into exhausted sleep, and Maya lay breathing softly in her crib, Charles sat alone by the dying fire, staring at the shadows on the wall. The sculptor who had once shaped stone into visions of beauty now wrestled with a truth he could not carve away. Their family was forever changed. And no matter how hard they fought, some storms could never be undone. The years passed slowly, marked not by milestones most families celebrated, but by the small victories Patricia and Charles Kungu. Maya grew into a bright-eyed child with an eager mind. She memorized nursery rhymes, recognized letters, and loved when her grandfather carved wooden animals for her collection. Her laughter often echoed through the old house, chasing away the heaviness that lingered there. Yet, no matter how sharp her mind became, her body remained stubborn. At 7 years old, Ma still could not walk. She relied on braces, on special chairs, on her grandmother's tireless hands guiding her through exercises that left them both exhausted. Patricia never once let frustration slip into her voice. "You're strong, sweetheart," she would whisper. "Stronger than you know." But behind her steady smile, Patricia's strength was fading. Years of strain weighed heavily on her heart. Literally, the chest pains began as whispers. Sharp stabs she dismissed as indigestion. Then they grew into steady aches, leaving her breathless after climbing the stairs. Charles noticed, urging her to see a doctor. She waved him off, pressing a hand to his cheek with weary affection. "I can't slow down, Charlie. Maya needs me." Even as her body weakened, Patricia poured herself into teaching Maya. Each morning, she spread books across the kitchen table, guiding small fingers through words and numbers. In the afternoons, she drilled English vocabulary and encouraged her granddaughter to dream of becoming a translator, reminding her that a sharp mind was just as powerful as strong legs. At night she read aloud, her voice sometimes breaking, but always finishing the story. Charles watched with both admiration and dread. He saw the paleness in Patricia's cheeks, the way she pressed a hand against her chest when she thought no one was looking. At night he lay awake, listening to her shallow breaths, afraid each one might be the last. The day it happened began like countless others. Patricia rose early, fixed Maya breakfast, and helped her through morning exercises. The sun was bright, the sky unusually clear over Portland. Charles was in his workshop when he heard the sound, a crash from inside the house, followed by Ma's frightened cry. He rushed in to find Patricia collapsed on the floor, one hand clutching her chest, her face drained of color. Ma sat frozen in her chair, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Grandma, get up!" she screamed. Charles knelt beside his wife, calling her name, pressing his hands against hers. He dialed 911 with shaking fingers, his voice breaking as he begged the dispatcher for help. The ambulance arrived quickly, sirens wailing, neighbors gathering outside in hushed concern. But by the time the paramedics wheeled Patricia into the emergency room, her heart had given out. Charles stood in the sterile hallway, the words "time of death" ringing in his ears like a final verdict. He felt the world tilt, a great silence descending inside him. The woman who had been his partner for decades, who had carried their family through storms he thought would crush them, was gone. Back home, the house felt unbearably empty. Maya clung to him, her small body shaking with sobs. "Where's Grandma? When is she coming back?" she pleaded. Charles swallowed his grief, forcing his voice steady. "Grandma's gone to heaven, sweetheart. But she's watching over you. Always." At night, after tucking Maya into bed, Charles walked alone to his workshop. The tools lay untouched, coated with dust. For days he sat there staring at the stone slabs waiting to be carved. Finally, with trembling hands, he chose one and began to work. Each strike of the chisel was both agony and release. Slowly, under his touch, the stone transformed into Patricia's likeness, her gentle smile, her steady gaze. Weeks later, he placed the finished sculpture on her grave, the gray stone catching the morning light. Standing there, Maya beside him in her chair, Charles whispered, "You'll never be gone, Pat. Not as long as this stands." His hand brushed the cool surface, as if hoping to feel the warmth of her skin once more. The cemetery wind carried the scent of the sea, mingling with the salt of his tears. Charles's shoulders shook, but when Mia's small hand reached for his, he steadied himself. He had lost the love of his life, but he could not collapse. A little girl with wide searching eyes still needed him to stand tall. And so, with grief carved deep into his soul, Charles turned away from the grave, guiding Maya's wheelchair through the quiet rows of headstones. Behind him, the stone figure of Patricia stood eternal, a silent promise that love the wounded would endure. Life in the Bennett household settled into a new rhythm after Patricia's passing. The grief never left, but Charles carried it quietly, the way he carried the weight of stone into his workshop. Each morning he prepared Maya's breakfast, adjusted her braces, and made sure her lessons were ready. He had arranged for a tutor through the local school district, part of an individualized education program designed to give Maya the best chance at progress. The living room became her classroom. Books stacked neatly on low shelves, a whiteboard propped against the wall. Charles hovered nearby during lessons, sometimes pretending to carve in the corner just so Maya would feel his presence. He never wanted her to sense abandonment. Not after everything she had already lost. The sound of chisels striking stone drifted through the house in the afternoons, while in the evenings he cooked simple meals, often burning the edges. But Maya never complained. She knew her grandfather's love was tucked into every plate. As Maya grew older, her mind blossomed far beyond her physical limitations. By her early teens, she read voraciously, devouring novels, biographies, even magazines that Charles brought home from the store. Her questions filled the air at night about history, about art, about the vast world beyond their quiet street in Portland. One Christmas, Charles surprised her with a computer. It was set up on a small desk by the window, the glow of the screen lighting her face as if it had opened a doorway to another universe. Through the internet, Maya found what her body had denied her: freedom. She joined forums, read articles, and most importantly, discovered friendship. That was how she met Sophie Reynolds. Sophie was her age, living in a suburb just a few towns away. Like Maya, she used a wheelchair, her spine injured in a childhood accident. Unlike Maya, Sophie had both parents and a younger brother, a bustling household filled with noise and warmth. Despite their different circumstances, the girls bonded instantly. They spoke for hours through Skype, sometimes falling asleep with the call still running, the soft hum of each other's breathing filling the silence of their rooms. They shared secrets, crushes, frustrations with therapy sessions, and dreams that seemed too fragile to speak aloud to anyone else. "I wish I could just get up and walk out the door," Maya confessed once, staring at her reflection in the dark computer screen. "Me, too," Sophie replied. "But maybe we don't need legs to go places. We've already got the world right here." She tapped her keyboard and grinned. Their friendship became a lifeline. Maya no longer felt the sharp edges of loneliness pressing in so fiercely. She had someone who understood the hours of stretching exercises, the stars from strangers, the constant calculation of how to fit into a world not built for them. Then one afternoon, Sophie's voice trembled with excitement. "I met someone," she whispered, cheeks flushed even through the grainy video. Maya leaned closer to the screen. "What do you mean? Like a boy?" Sophie nodded, her smile radiant. "His name is Alex. We met at the university cafeteria. He carried my tray when I was struggling. And then he walked me home. He didn't even flinch when he saw my chair. He just treated me like any other girl." For weeks, Maya listened to Sophie's stories about the texts, the walks, the way Alex laughed at her jokes. Soon came the news that he had asked her to be his girlfriend. Sophie's happiness poured through every word, every smile, every late-night call. Maya rejoiced with her friend, clapping and cheering through the screen. Yet when the call ended and the room fell silent, a different emotion pressed heavily on her chest. She wheeled herself to the window, staring out at the quiet Portland street dusted with snow. The houses glowed with warm lights, families gathering around dinner tables. She imagined what it might feel like to have someone look at her the way Alex looked at Sophie. To be seen not as fragile or dependent, but as a girl, worthy of love, of attention, of being chosen. The thought stirred both longing and pain. Charles noticed the shadow in her eyes, but said nothing. He only carved longer in the evenings, the rhythm of hammer and chisel filling the silence between them. He prayed silently that one day his granddaughter might know the same joy her friend had found, that she might taste love, however complicated it might be. For now Maya smiled through her ache, congratulating Sophie on every milestone. Their friendship remained her anchor, even as a quiet yearning began to take root inside her heart. A yearning that would shape the next chapter of her life. By the time Maya turned 19, her world had stretched beyond the walls of the Bennett home. Through books, through Sophie's endless stories, and through the glow of her computer screen, she discovered pieces of the life she longed for, but could never fully grasp. When Sophie married Alex in a small winter ceremony, Maya watched every moment through live stream. Her best friend radiant in a white dress, Alex holding her hand with pride, his love evident in every gesture. Maya smiled, clapped, typed congratulations in the chat. But when the call ended, she sat in silence, staring at her own reflection in the dark screen, the ache of longing sharp in her chest. It was Sophie who first suggested she try online dating. Why not? Her friend urged people meet all kinds of ways now. You deserve love as much as anyone else. Maybe more. So one late evening after Charles had gone to bed, Maya created a profile on a dating site. Cupid, the screen bright against the quiet of her room. She typed carefully, describing her love of books, her fascination with languages, her dream of traveling the world. She hesitated over the part about her disability, finally choosing to leave it unsaid. Messages trickled in, most shallow, some cruel, but one stood out. His name was Matthew Harris. His profile picture showed a young man with kind eyes, light brown hair falling slightly over his forehead. His first message was simple. You seem really interesting. Would you like to talk from that night? Their conversations never stopped. They spoke about music, about their favorite films, about childhood memories that made them laugh until they cried. Matthew asked questions no one else had ever bothered to ask. What books inspired her? What places she dreamed of visiting? What made her feel alive? With each passing day, Maya felt pieces of herself unfolding, revealed in ways she had never dared share before. For 2 months, they spoke every night. Sometimes they stayed awake until dawn, voices soft through the speakers, reluctant to say goodbye. Matthew's voice was steady, warm, carrying a gentleness that wrapped around Maya like a blanket. For the first time in her life, she felt chosen. Then one evening, Matthew asked the question she had both longed for and feared. Can I see you in person? Her heart raced. She wanted to say no to keep the fragile perfection of their online world intact. But his voice carried such sincerity, such hope that she found herself whispering yes. They agreed on a Saturday evening. Charles would be away at his workshop. Maya spent the day preparing, brushing her thick, dark hair until it gleamed, applying light makeup, slipping into her favorite blue dress. She wheeled herself to the mirror, studying her reflection with trembling anticipation. At 6 o'clock, the doorbell rang. She opened it to find Matthew standing there taller than she expected. A bouquet of white roses in his hands, his smile was bright, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. Hi, Maya, he said softly. For a moment, the world seemed to tilt in her favor. She invited him in, her voice shy but steady. He stepped inside, setting the flowers on the table. His eyes lingered on hers, and she felt her heart lift. But then, inevitably, his gaze shifted. It dropped slowly, landing on the wheelchair beneath her. His smile faltered. The light in his eyes dimmed. Maya's breath caught. She watched as confusion. Then, discomfort spread across his face. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Instead, he stepped back, his hand brushing nervously against the doorknob. He stammered, his voice cracking. Then, without another word, he turned and hurried out the door, the sound of his footsteps pounding down the porch steps, swallowed by the rising wind. The roses remained on the table, their petals trembling as the door slammed shut. Maya sat frozen, the silence pressing around her. Slowly, her chest heaved and tears spilled down her cheeks. She wheeled herself to the window, watching the storm gather outside. Snow whipped through the streetlights. The blizzard's howl, echoing the shatter inside her heart. She whispered to the empty room, "Why am I never enough?" Her voice cracked raw and jagged. She pressed her hands to her face, sobs tearing free. That night, the storm outside raged like none she had ever seen. But the one inside her was worse. Alone in the dark house, the bouquet of roses wilting by her side, Maya wept until her body shook, convinced that love was something forever out of reach. The blizzard raged through the night, snow piling high along the quiet Portland street. Inside the Bennett home, Ma sat in her chair by the window, her face strewn with tears. The bouquet of roses still lay on the table, petals sagging as if mirroring her heart. The storm outside felt like a reflection of the chaos within. Every gust of wind a reminder of what she had just lost. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. Then, sometime midnight, the doorbell rang. Maya froze, her breath caught in her throat. She thought at first it must be her imagination, but the bell rang again, urgent, insistent. With trembling hands, she wheeled herself to the door. When she opened it, the freezing wind rushed in, and there he was, Matthew Harris, snow clinging to his coat and hair, his chest rising and falling as though he had run the whole way. His eyes were wide, filled with something rarer than the polite warmth she had first seen in them. "Maya," he began, his voice breaking. "Please don't shut the door. I need to explain." She stared at him, her heart pounding. The memory of him running away was still a wound too fresh to touch. Her voice was sharp, jagged. "You left. You saw me and ran. What else is there to explain?" Matthew flinched, guilt washing over his face. "I know, and I'll regret that moment for the rest of my life if you let me." I was shocked, caught off guard. "You never mentioned the chair, and when I saw it, I froze. Not because of you, but because of me. Because I wasn't the man I thought I was." Snow swirled between them, flakes clinging to his eyelashes. His voice grew steadier. "I don't care about the chair. I care about you. The girl who stayed up until dawn laughing with me. The girl whose words make me want to be better. I was a coward, but I don't want to be anymore." Her throat tightened, tears threatening again. "And how do I know this isn't just pity? That you won't walk away the next time it gets hard?" Matthew stepped closer, his breath visible in the icy air. "Because I came back. Because I couldn't sleep knowing I'd hurt you. Because when I pictured my life without hearing your voice tomorrow, it felt empty." The words broke something inside her. Tears spilled down her cheeks, hot against the cold wind. For so long she had believed love was out of reach, that no one could see past her chair, past the body that betrayed her. And yet here he was, standing in the snow, asking for another chance. Her voice was barely a whisper. "I'm scared." "So am I," Matthew admitted, "but maybe we can be scared together." Slowly, she moved aside, allowing him in. He stepped over the threshold, shutting out the storm, the warmth of the house wrapping around them. The roses still lay wilted on the table. But when Matthew noticed them, he touched the petals gently. "I'll bring new ones tomorrow," he promised. They talked long into the night, the storm outside muffling the world beyond their walls. For the first time, Maya allowed herself to hope, to believe that maybe she was not destined to be alone. Upstairs, Charles stirred from his bed. Hearing voices, he walked quietly to the landing and looked down. In the glow of the lamplight, he saw his granddaughter, her eyes red from crying, but now alive with something fierce and fragile. Beside her sat Matthew, speaking with care, his hand resting gently on the table, never pushing, never demanding. Charles's throat tightened. In that moment, he saw Patricia in Maya's resilience, in the way she opened herself to the possibility of joy despite years of pain. He stood there in silence, unseen, a mixture of sorrow and gratitude in his chest. He whispered into the empty hallway. She would be proud. Outside, the snowstorm continued its relentless howl, blanketing the city in white. But inside the Bennett home, the air was different. The fire crackled softly. The glow of the lamp spilled warmth across the room, and in the quiet space between two broken hearts, something new had begun to take shape. It was not certainty. It was not the promise of a simple path, but it was a spark, a fragile flame of hope refusing to be extinguished. As Maya wiped her tears, her laughter broke through again, soft and hesitant at first, then stronger, and Charles, listening from the shadows, allowed himself the smallest of smiles. The storm outside would pass. It always did. What mattered now was the light inside, the kind that no winter could snuff out.